Welcome back to Secrets Exposed. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. You're the reason these stories worth sharing. Tell us where you're watching from, city or country. We're amazed by how far these tales reach. To get daily new and amazing stories for you, subscribe our channel and press bell icon. All right, let's begin. The highway stretched endlessly under the weight of midnight. Only the low hum of David Hale's truck filled the silence, a sound that had become his only company on nights like this. He drove with the window cracked open, letting the sharp bite of cool air sting his face and keep him awake. The world outside was a blur of shadows, broken only by the occasional glow of a passing neon sign or the flash of headlights in the opposite lane. His eyes burned from exhaustion. It had been a long shift at the plant, followed by another hour of driving. He wasn't even supposed to stop tonight, but the fuel gauge needle dipped close to empty, and the last thing he wanted was to break down in the middle of nowhere. So when the faint glow of a gas station appeared ahead, its flickering red and blue sign buzzing against the dark sky, David pulled in. The place was nearly deserted, just a single sedan parked near the store entrance, and one other car pulled up to the far pump. The station lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, yellow glow on cracked pavement stained with years of oil and gasoline. David parked by pump 4, switched off the engine, and rubbed his temples. The smell of gasoline, fried food, and stale cigarettes mixed into a sour cocktail that clung to the air. He reached for his wallet, but then something made him stop. A faint clinking sound, metal dragging against concrete. His head turned. At pump 3, under the harsh glow of the neon light, a boy was filling a car's tank. His clothes hung loose on a thin frame. Faded jeans, a shirt that was 2 sizes too big. His hands trembled slightly as he worked the nozzle, moving with the stiff rhythm of someone too tired to even stand straight. But it wasn't the boy's frailty that froze David's breath in his throat. It was the chain. A heavy iron chain, locked around the boy's ankle, dragging with every step he took. The metallic scrape echoed through the lot, louder than the buzzing lights, louder than the hum of David's own heartbeat. David's eyes widened. His pulse thundered in his ears as he tried to make sense of it. A child, chained, working a gas pump in the dead of night. And then the boy turned slightly, just enough for the light to catch his face. David's world stopped. The jawline, the messy brown hair falling across his forehead. The eyes, haunted, tired but unmistakable. It was Ethan, his son. David's knees weakened, and he nearly stumbled against his truck door. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, conjuring Ethan's face out of exhaustion and guilt. But no, this wasn't a dream. It was him, his boy, his flesh and blood. Ethan, whom he hadn't seen in nearly a year. Ethan, whom he had left in the custody of Laura, trusting her promises of sobriety. Ethan, who should have been at home, safe in bed, not here, chained like an animal at a gas station. David's lips parted, his breath shaking. Ethan, the name never fully left his throat, because just a few feet away, watching with the cold eyes of a predator, stood a man in a black leather jacket. Broad-shouldered, arms crossed, his gaze sharp and unblinking. The man leaned casually against the hood of the car, but his posture radiated control, menace. David froze, his hand tightening around the edge of the truck door. He understood instantly. The boy wasn't here by accident. He was being watched, guarded. Ethan bent slightly, fumbling with the gas cap. His thin fingers struggled with the metal. The chain clinked again. And in that moment, Ethan looked up. Their eyes met. Ethan's face flickered with something, recognition, disbelief, then despair. His lips trembled. His eyes, once full of the careless innocence of a boy, now glistened with the broken weight of someone far older. David felt his chest cave in. He wanted to run to him, pull him into his arms, scream at the man in the jacket, call the police, anything. But his legs wouldn't move. His heart pounded too loud. The boy's lips moved, barely forming words. David leaned forward, straining to hear. And though the sound was faint, the expression on Ethan's face said everything: pain, shame, and a desperate, silent plea. In that moment, David Hale knew his life had just shattered. The boy in chains wasn't just any child. He was his son. David's breath caught as Ethan's lips trembled, shaping words that barely carried through the heavy night air. "Don't," Ethan whispered, his voice raw, cracked like glass. "Please don't." David froze in place, his chest tightening. The boy's eyes weren't just tired, they were pleading. They carried a warning, a desperation that went deeper than fear. The man in the leather jacket shifted, spitting onto the pavement. His eyes narrowed in suspicion, and David quickly looked away, pretending to adjust his jacket. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention, not when Ethan was right there in chains. But he couldn't stay silent. He couldn't ignore the trembling voice of his son. He took a cautious step forward, lowering his voice. "Ethan, it's me. It's Dad." The boy flinched, almost dropping the nozzle. His thin shoulders hunched inward as though the sound of the word Dad was more painful than comforting. He swallowed hard, tears glinting in the weak neon light. And then, in a voice that seemed torn from the deepest part of him, Ethan muttered, "Mom sold me to fuel her addiction." The words struck David like a hammer to the chest. For a moment, the world blurred. The buzzing lights overhead, the smell of gasoline, the man's watchful gaze, all of it faded into nothing. All that remained are those 5 words. "Mom sold me." David's heart raced. His ex-wife, Laura, had sworn she was getting better. She had begged him to give her another chance, swore she could handle custody. He had believed her. Foolishly, he had convinced himself that Ethan would be safer with his mother than in the chaos of his one-bedroom apartment, with his double shifts and empty fridge. And now, Ethan was standing in front of him, chained, enslaved, broken. David staggered back a step, his throat burning. No, that can't be true. She wouldn't. His words collapsed under their own weight. Ethan shook his head sharply, the chain rattling as he shifted his stance. She did. For drugs. For money. For herself. His voice cracked again, but this time anger pushed through. She chose her addiction over me. David's eyes burned with tears he couldn't control. He wanted to scream, to storm across the concrete and rip the chain off his son's ankle with his bare hands. But Ethan's glare pinned him in place. "You left me with her." Ethan spat, his whisper sharp as broken glass. "You left. You trusted her. And look what happened." The words pierced deeper than the cold night air ever could. David felt his legs weaken, the shame crushing him. Every argument he'd had with Laura, every time he convinced himself that walking away was the right thing, all of it twisted into a cruel weight now pressing down on him. I thought she'd protect you," David whispered, his voice shaking. Ethan's jaw tightened, and his lip trembled. "You were supposed to protect me." David's knees nearly buckled. He wanted to beg forgiveness, to tell Ethan that he had been wrong, that he would never abandon him again. But before he could speak, the man in the leather jacket barked out. "Hey!" David snapped his head up. The man pushed off the car and strode toward Ethan, eyes sharp and suspicious. "What's taking so long, huh?" He shoved Ethan in the shoulder, making him stumble against the pump. The chain rattled harshly as it scraped across the ground. Ethan quickly lowered his head, muttering, "Sorry, it's stuck." His voice was flat, practiced, like he had learned how to shrink himself to survive. The man's eyes flicked toward David. For a second, David's heart stopped. The thug's gaze lingered, cold and calculating, before he finally turned back toward the store. "Hurry it up. We don't got all night." Ethan's hands shook as he fumbled with the gas cap, tears still streaking his cheeks. He didn't look at David again. David gripped the edge of his truck so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, torn between the crushing guilt of Ethan's words and the urgent need to act. His son was chained, beaten down, and used like property. And every second that passed was another second stolen from him. He whispered to himself, his voice almost a vow, "I'm not leaving you again." The night pressed down on him, but inside, something hardened. David knew he had to make a move soon. David stood frozen beside his truck, his chest hollow, his mind spinning with Ethan's broken words. "Mom sold me." The phrase cut deeper with every passing second. He wanted to speak, to bridge the distance, but Ethan kept his head low, his hair falling over his eyes like a curtain. David stepped closer, lowering his voice. Ethan, I swear I didn't know. If I had. Ethan snapped his head up, his face streaked with tears, his eyes blazing with fury. Stop. His voice was sharp, bitter, trembling not just with fear, but with rage. You left me with her. You knew what she was like, and you still walked away. David's mouth opened, but no words came. The truth was a noose tightening around his throat. I beg you to stay. Ethan hissed, his voice cracking. And you left. You chose your job, your stupid shifts, your life without me. David staggered, his heart shattering. I thought you'd be safer. Safer? Ethan's voice rose, but he quickly dropped it to a whisper when Mark's head turned slightly. He leaned toward his father, his words like venom. Look at me. He rattled the chain with his foot. The sound echoed like judgment. Is this safer? David's chest burned as if someone had struck him. Ethan's lips trembled, his face twisted with pain that no child should ever know. You're worthless, he spat. His voice shook, but the hatred in it was real. You let her destroy me. The words slammed into David harder than any punch could. For years, he had lived with guilt, that leaving Ethan behind was a coward's choice. He had buried it under excuses, under the belief that maybe, somehow, Laura could be better. Now, hearing those words from his own son ripped the last threads of denial apart. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. All the years of regret, all the times he had convinced himself he had done the right thing, collapsed in a single moment. I'm sorry, David whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. But Ethan's face hardened, his jaw clenched. He looked away, focusing on the nozzle as gasoline dripped onto the pavement, the smell sharp and suffocating. David wanted to scream, to tell him he would fix this, that he would never let anyone hurt him again. But his son didn't want words. His son wanted proof. Before David could gather his thoughts, Mark pushed off from the car again, walking back toward Ethan. His boots crunched against gravel, his steps heavy with authority. What's the holdup? Mark growled, shoving Ethan in the back. Pump's not going to fill itself. Ethan flinched but didn't argue. He twisted the nozzle, forcing the fuel into the tank. His hands shook violently, but he kept his eyes down. Submission. Survival. Mark's gaze slid to David. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. For a long moment, David felt the weight of that stare pressing into him, testing him. His pulse thundered in his ears. Finally, Mark grunted and spat on the ground. Mind your own business, he muttered, before striding toward the station's convenience store. David let out a slow, shaking breath. His hands were trembling, his body buzzing with adrenaline. He had seconds, maybe minutes, before Mark came back. And in those seconds, his son was chained like a prisoner, pumping fuel in silence. He couldn't let it continue. Ethan, he whispered urgently. Listen to me. I'm going to get you out of here. Tonight. Ethan froze, his shoulders tense. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes glistening with fresh tears. But instead of hope, there was something else in them. Doubt, exhaustion, disbelief. You said that before, Ethan muttered bitterly. You promised you'd protect me once. You left me. You won't save me now. David's heart clenched. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, forcing every word out with trembling conviction. I will not fail you again. I don't care what it takes. But Ethan's silence cut deeper than his anger. He didn't argue. He didn't believe. He just turned back to the pump, gripping the nozzle like it was the only thing holding him upright. The chain rattled again, scraping across the pavement. David's hand brushed against the back of his truck. His fingers curled around the cold steel of a tire iron lying in the bed. For the first time, his grief turned into something else, a simmering fire that rose up through his veins. If no one else would protect Ethan, he would, and he would start tonight. The night pressed heavy on David's shoulders as he gripped the tire iron. Its weight was cold, solid, real, unlike the chaos in his chest. For a moment, he stood frozen by his truck, his breath fogging in the air, his eyes locked on Ethan's fragile frame. The boy hunched over the pump, shoulders shaking, the chain dragging faintly as he shifted his stance. David's mind screamed two voices at once. One said to wait, call the police, stay calm, don't make it worse. The other roared louder, a fire that drowned out reason. If you wait, you'll lose him again. Forever. The door to the convenience store squealed open. Mark stepped out, a bag of chips in one hand, a pistol holstered loosely at his side. He chewed loudly, swaggering toward Ethan as though he owned the night. His eyes flicked to David, narrowing with suspicion again. David's heart pounded, his grip tightening around the iron until his knuckles whitened. His son stood chained like an animal, and the man who kept him there chewed snacks with casual cruelty. Mark shoved Ethan's shoulder. "Move it! Faster!" The boy stumbled, gasoline splattering onto the pavement, its sharp scent rising into the air. Ethan's lip quivered, but he didn't fight back. He just kept his head down. Something inside David snapped. In one motion, he pulled the tire iron free from the bed of his truck and charged. Mark barely had time to register the blur rushing at him. He dropped the chips, reaching for his pistol, but David swung hard. The iron connected with Mark's wrist, the crack echoing into the night. The pistol clattered to the ground, skidding across the oily pavement. "Dad!" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking with terror and disbelief. Mark snarled, clutching his wrist. His eyes blazed with fury as he lunged at David, driving a fist into his ribs. Pain exploded through David's side, but he swung again, the iron grazing Mark's shoulder. They grappled violently, boots scraping, the sound of chains rattling as Ethan stumbled back, yanking against the shackle. The gasoline pump slipped from his hands, fuel splashing across the ground. The sharp stench filled the air, mixing with sweat and adrenaline. David grunted as Mark slammed him against the side of his truck, the impact rattling through his bones. "You think you could take what's mine?" Mark hissed. "He's not yours." David roared, driving the tire iron upward into Mark's jaw. The man staggered, blood trickling from his lip. Ethan's cries pierced the chaos. "Stop! Stop!" He tugged against the chain, desperate, his voice breaking. His eyes darted to the pistol lying just a few feet away, glinting under the neon light. Mark saw it too. He shoved David aside, scrambling toward the weapon. David lunged after him, slamming his weight against Mark's back. Both men hit the ground hard, fists and elbows flying. The pistol slid closer to Ethan. He stared at it, frozen. His thin chest heaved, torn between fear and a desperate spark of courage. But his hands shook too violently. He couldn't move. David grappled with Mark, the tire iron slipping from his grasp. Mark's fist connected with his face, pain bursting behind his eyes. But David didn't stop. He grabbed Mark by the collar, slamming his head against the concrete once, twice. Blood smeared across the pavement. Gasoline pooled around them, the air thick with its toxic fumes. Mark groaned, dazed, his hand stretching blindly toward the gun. David kicked it out of reach, chest heaving. His vision swam, but rage fueled him. He raised the tire iron again, ready to end this. "Dad, no!" Ethan screamed, his voice raw. The sound cut through David like a blade. He froze, trembling, the iron still raised. His son was staring at him, eyes wide, filled not with hope, but with fear. Fear of him. David's chest constricted. His arm shook. He lowered the iron slowly, his breath ragged. Mark coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. "Big mistake," he rasped. His hand twitched toward his jacket pocket. Before David could react, the distant wail of sirens sliced through the night. Ethan's chain rattled violently as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide. David's blood ran cold. The sirens grew louder, closer, until the parking lot lit up with flashing red and blue. Police cruisers screeched in, tires skidding across wet pavement. Doors burst open. Guns were drawn. Shouts filled the air. And in that frozen second, David thought relief had come, that help was finally here. But then he realized every gun was pointed not at Mark, not at him. They were aimed at Ethan. The gas station erupted into chaos. Sirens wailed, red and blue lights flashing across every surface, painting the cracked pavement in a dizzying blur. Officers shouted commands over one another, their boots slamming against the ground as they fanned out with weapons drawn. On the ground, hands where we can see them. David staggered back, his chest heaving. His mind screamed with relief. They had come just in time. Mark was sprawled on the pavement, blood dripping from his mouth, too dazed to move. This was it. They would arrest him, cut the chains, save Ethan. But then the officers charged, not at Mark, not at him. They rushed Ethan. David's heart stopped. Wait. No. Two officers slammed Ethan to the ground, forcing his arms behind his back. The chain clattered against the concrete, the sound sharp, cruel. Ethan cried out, his small body twisting under their weight. Please. Don't hurt me. His voice cracked into sobs, terror flooding every syllable. David stumbled forward, desperate, his hands raised. Stop. He's just a boy. He's my son. A rifle swung toward him. Back. Now. David froze, the barrel of the weapon inches from his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps as he raised his trembling hands higher. The night spun around him, confusion clouding everything. Why were they treating Ethan like the criminal? Behind him, Mark groaned, blood smearing across his jaw. But no one touched him. No one cuffed him. Their focus was all on Ethan. David's voice broke. You got it wrong. He's a victim. Can't you see the chains? One officer snarled, pressing Ethan harder into the ground. That's not a victim. That's bait. The words slammed into David like a punch to the gut. What? He whispered, shaking his head. No, you don't understand. That's my son. Another officer glanced at him, her face set, her voice cold. Your son's been part of an ongoing operation. You step 1 foot closer, you're obstructing federal law. Ethan sobbed under their grip, his cheek pressed against the concrete, his voice barely audible. Dad, please. David's chest tightened, his heart tearing. He dropped his hands slowly, but his voice grew louder, angrier. He's 13. He's a child. What the hell are you doing to him? But the officers didn't answer. They yanked Ethan upright, his arms still pinned behind his back. His knees buckled, the chain dragging limply from his ankle as they pulled him toward one of the cruisers. David's body shook with rage and helplessness. He lunged forward instinctively, but a firm hand shoved him back against his truck, hard enough to rattle his bones. The officer's cold eyes locked on him. Stay put. David's vision blurred with tears. He could barely hear over the pounding in his ears. His son's face flashed under the strobing lights, pale, streaked with tears, twisted with terror. Ethan turned his head, his voice breaking in one final plea. Dad, don't let them take me. David's fists clenched. His entire body screamed to fight, to tear through the wall of uniforms, to rip the chains off his boy. But a dozen rifles stood between them, ready to cut him down. And through it all, the words echoed again. That's not a victim. That's bait. David's stomach twisted, nausea clawing at him. His mind replayed Ethan's whisper from earlier. Mom sold me to fuel her addiction. It all tangled into something darker, something he couldn't yet understand. Laura. She hadn't just sold Ethan to a man like Mark. She had sold him into something bigger, something worse. And the police, the people who were supposed to protect him, were treating his son like a tool. David's throat burned as he shouted into the chaos, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. He's my son. He's my son. But no one looked at him. No one cared. They shoved Ethan into the back of a cruiser, the doors slamming shut with a hollow, final sound. David staggered, his back against his truck, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the car where his son sat trembling behind glass. The sirens still blared, but all David heard was the faint rattle of a chain, and his son's broken voice echoing in his head. You're worthless. The rain finally broke. Fat droplets splattered across the pavement, sizzling as they hit the gasoline pooled around the pumps. The sirens had died down, but the flashing red and blue lights still washed over the station, bathing everything in a dizzying glow. David stood in the middle of it, soaked and trembling, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. His eyes stayed locked on the cruiser where Ethan sat huddled, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes swollen from tears. The door of the store banged open, and a tall officer stepped out, a raincoat flapping at his sides. He was older, with graying hair and a lined face that looked carved from stone. Authority radiated from him with every stride. David Hale, The officer barked. David turned sharply. Yes, that's my son in there. What the hell are you doing to him? His voice cracked, a mix of rage and desperation. The officer stopped a few feet away, his hands resting calmly on his belt. Your son, he said flatly, is part of a federal sting. You just compromised 3 months of work. David's head spun. What? He staggered forward. No, you've got it wrong. He's a victim. Look at him. They had him chained like an animal. The officer's gaze didn't waver. We put that chain there. The words slammed into David like a steel beam. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. You what? The officer's voice remained steady, rehearsed. We needed to make it look real. If traffickers believed the boy was truly enslaved, they'd come here. They'd trust the setup. Your son was bait, and he played his role perfectly. David's entire body went cold. His stomach lurched violently, bile rising in his throat. He's 13, he whispered, his voice trembling. You used my son as bait. The officer's jaw tightened. We had the mother's consent. The world tilted. David's breath caught in his chest. Laura? The officer nodded once. She was picked up 6 months ago on possession charges. She agreed to cooperate with us in exchange for a lighter sentence. David's vision blurred, his knees threatening to buckle. No, he shook his head violently. No, she wouldn't, she couldn't. She did. The officer's tone was cold, final. She handed the boy over to us, signed the papers herself. She said she couldn't take care of him, but she could help us put traffickers behind bars. David staggered backward, his hand clutching his chest. His mind spun through every memory of Laura, her broken promises, her trembling hands when she swore she was getting clean, the time she said she'd never hurt Ethan. He had wanted to believe her, needed to believe her, and now the truth gutted him. She hadn't just failed Ethan. She had betrayed him. The officer's voice cut through the storm. We were close. We had them tonight, until you stepped in. Do you realize what you've done? David's eyes snapped up, blazing with fury. What I've done? His voice roared, raw and guttural. I found my son chained to a gas pump, crying, begging for help. And you want to tell me I'm the problem? The officer didn't flinch. You let emotion cloud your judgment. This is bigger than you, Hale. Bigger than him. David lunged forward, his voice breaking with rage. Nothing is bigger than him. He's my son. The two officers nearby tensed, hands on their weapons. But David didn't care. His body shook, his heart tearing itself apart. He had left Ethan with Laura because he thought it was safer. And Laura had sold him to the system, the very people sworn to protect him. Behind the cruiser window, Ethan's eyes met his. They were hollow, resigned, as if even hope itself had abandoned him. The sight crushed David more than any blow could. He whispered, almost to himself, I failed you once. I won't fail you again. The officer's voice snapped back, sharp and impatient. You need to stand down. Walk away. Let us finish this. But David didn't move. Not an inch. His eyes stayed on Ethan, rain streaking down his face like tears. Inside him, something hardened. A decision. A vow. If Laura had betrayed their son, if the system had chained him, then David would be the one to break those chains. No matter the cost. Rain poured harder now, pounding against the gas station roof, mixing with the sharp stench of spilled fuel. Red and blue lights strobed across the puddles, casting fractured reflections that seemed as broken as David's soul. He stood rigid, chest heaving, his eyes locked on the cruiser where Ethan sat. The boy was hunched over, his forehead against the glass, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Every time the strobe lights passed, David caught a flash of his son's tear-streaked face. The older officer hadn't moved, his stance steady, his tone calm but immovable. Mr. Hale, I need you to listen carefully. You're not in control here. Your interference has already jeopardized this operation. The best thing you can do for your son right now is stand down. David's fists clenched, his jaw locked, so tightly it ached. Stand down? You chained him. You threw him into hell and called it justice. And now you're telling me to let you keep him like this. The officer's gaze didn't falter. This isn't personal. This is about dismantling a network that destroys children. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary. David stepped forward, his voice rising with raw fury. You don't get to use that word. He's not a sacrifice. He's my son. Two officers nearby immediately raised their rifles, lasers flickering against his chest. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, the storm's roar drowned everything out. Inside the cruiser, Ethan lifted his head. His lips moved, barely forming words. David couldn't hear him through the rain, but he could read the shape of his mouth. Don't fight them. The police shattered him. His boy was begging him not to make it worse. David's chest heaved as he pressed a hand against the side of the cruiser, his palm flat against the glass. Ethan, I'm here. I'm not leaving. His voice trembled, but he forced each word out, hoping they would anchor his son even as everything else collapsed. Ethan shook his head, his eyes red, his mouth twisting with pain. You can't stop them, he mouthed. Tears streaked down his cheeks. Nobody can. The hopelessness in his voice tore through David. His son, the boy who used to laugh until his stomach hurt, who once believed monsters only lived under the bed, now sat convinced the real monsters wore badges. David turned back to the officer, rage burning through his despair. You talk about justice, about saving kids. But look at him. Look at what you've done. He's broken. For the first time, the officer's stoic mask flickered. A shadow crossed his eyes, but his voice remained steady. If this works, we save hundreds more like him. David's voice broke. What good is saving hundreds if you destroy the one you already have? Silence hung in the air, broken only by the hammering rain. The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Suddenly, Mark groaned on the pavement. The thug spat blood, his laugh low and bitter. You're all fools, he rasped. That boy ain't yours anymore. He belongs to the game now. David lunged at him, fury blazing, but two officers restrained him, their grips like iron. He thrashed, veins bulging at his neck, until he caught sight of Ethan's terrified face pressed against the window. The sight snapped the fight out of him. He slumped, his voice hoarse. Please, he's just a kid. He doesn't deserve this. The older officer glanced toward the cruiser, then back at David. For the first time, his voice softened. You're right. He doesn't, but he's already in it. Pulling him now would blow everything wide open. The people we're after, they'd vanish. And your son's suffering would mean nothing. David's chest heaved. He wanted to scream, to tear the world apart. But his son's sobs muffled through the glass, kept him grounded. Ethan had already been betrayed once by his mother. If David lost control now, he'd betray him again. Slowly, he nodded, swallowing the rage that burned like fire in his throat. Then hear me. When this is over, I'm taking him back. No more chains. No more lies. He's mine. The officer studied him for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. If you can hold it together, maybe. The word maybe seared David like acid. But for now, it was all he had. As the rain poured harder, David pressed his hand against the cruiser window once more. Ethan mirrored the gesture, his chained wrist trembling. Their palms separated by glass. Father and son clung to the one fragile promise left between them. That somehow, against every force tearing them apart, they would find their way back to each other. The storm raged on, hammering the station roof as if the sky itself wanted to drown the night. The flashing lights from the cruisers painted the rain in streaks of red and blue, surreal and violent. David's hand remained pressed against the cruiser window, his palm flat against the cold glass. On the other side, Ethan's smaller hand trembled, trying to match it. Father and son, separated by nothing more than inches of glass and everything else in the world. But then the slam of the car door broke the fragile moment. Let's move him, an officer barked. Two men approached the cruiser, their boots splashing through puddles. One unlocked the back door and yanked it open. The other reached in, grabbing Ethan by the arm. Ethan panicked instantly, thrashing in their grip. No, no, please. His voice cracked, raw and broken. He kicked wildly, the chain on his ankle clinking against the metal floor. David lunged forward, his voice exploding over the rain. Stop! Where are you taking him? The older officer intercepted, blocking his path. His voice was calm but stern. a brick wall against David's rage. He's being transported to a secure site. Safer for him. Safer for the operation. Safer. David spat the word like poison. You're ripping him apart in front of me. He's terrified. Behind him, Ethan screamed, "Dad." His voice tore through the storm, desperate and pleading. Don't let them take me. David's entire body trembled with helplessness. He shoved at the officer, but instantly felt cold steel pressed against his chest, the muzzle of a rifle. One more move, the officer growled, and you'll be spending the night in a cell instead of your son. David froze, his breath ragged, his fists trembling at his sides. Ethan's cries grew weaker as the officers dragged him out of the cruiser. The boy kicked and twisted, but he was no match for their iron grip. His eyes locked on David's, wide with terror. Please, please, Dad. David's chest burned, his lungs heaving as though he were drowning. Every instinct screamed at him to charge forward, to tear them apart, to free his son even if it cost him his life. But the rifle stayed trained on him, unblinking, unshaking. He would die before he got 2 steps. They shoved Ethan into a black SUV parked at the edge of the lot. The door slammed, locking him inside. His face pressed against the tinted window, his fists banging weakly against the glass. David could barely see him through the rain, but he felt his son's voice like a knife in his chest. Dad, don't let them. The rest was muffled, swallowed by the storm as the SUV's engine roared to life. David stumbled forward, soaked and shaking. Where are you taking him? His voice cracked with desperation. The older officer finally answered, his words clipped and cold. Safe house. He'll stay there until the operation concludes. You'll be contacted when it's over. David's eyes widened. Weeks? Months? You're just going to lock him away like a prisoner. The officer's jaw tightened. We're protecting him. Protecting him? David's voice thundered, cutting through the rain. You chained him to a gas pump. You let strangers shove him around like property. You broke him. And you call that protection? The officer didn't reply. He simply motioned to his team. The SUV's headlights flared through the storm, cutting white beams into the darkness. David staggered, his legs weak, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for himself. I failed you once, Ethan. I won't fail you again. The SUVs began to roll out, tires crunching over gravel, splashing through puddles. David's heart pounded harder with each passing second. He could stand there and let them disappear into the night, trust the same system that had already shattered his boy. Or he could follow. His gaze dropped to his truck, the rain streaming down its windshield. His keys were still in the ignition. David clenched his fists, the decision carving itself deep into his bones. He wouldn't stand down. Not again. Not ever. As the convoy pulled onto the highway, David slid into his truck. His hands gripped the wheel, his eyes burning with fury and resolve. Headlights cut through the storm as he pulled out, trailing the line of SUVs. Whatever it took, wherever they went, he would not let his son vanish into the system's shadows. Not this time. The highway stretched out like a black ribbon, slick with rain and glistening under the glow of passing headlights. David's wipers struggled against the downpour, but he barely noticed. His eyes stayed locked on the faint red taillights ahead, the convoy. 2 SUVs, one in front and one behind, boxed in the larger vehicle carrying Ethan. David's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles had turned white. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the windshield wipers, fast, uneven, relentless. Every mile the convoy pulled further from the gas station felt like another mile, tearing his son away from him. In the back of the middle SUV, Ethan sat shackled, his wrists bound in front of him. The chain on his ankle was shorter now, looped to a metal ring on the floor. He tried tugging once, but the lock held firm. His chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. The tinted windows turned the world outside into a blur of streaking lights, and every bump in the road jolted his small frame. Across from him, an officer sat with a rifle resting casually between his knees, his gaze fixed coldly on the boy. Settle down, the man muttered. You're safe here. Safe. The word burned in Ethan's ears. Safe didn't feel like steel biting into his skin. Safe didn't feel like being dragged away from the only person left who would try to fight for him. Ethan's lip trembled as he whispered to himself, "Dad." In the truck, trailing behind, David leaned forward, straining to see through the sheets of rain. His mind raced, every thought a war between rage and fear. He had no plan, just raw instinct. He couldn't let the SUVs vanish. If he did, Ethan would disappear into some faceless facility, another case file in a system that had already failed him. The convoy slowed as flashing lights appeared ahead, a temporary checkpoint. Orange cones glistened under the storm, and a floodlight lit up the soaked pavement. Officers with raincoats stood guard, their radios crackling through the storm. David's chest tightened. If he followed too closely, he'd be noticed. If he hung back, he'd lose them. He flicked off his headlights, letting the truck's dark shape fade into the storm, creeping forward a crawl. Inside the SUV, Ethan glanced toward the window, straining to see through the blur. For a split second, between raindrops, he thought he caught sight of a familiar truck's outline. His chest squeezed. "Dad," he whispered again, his voice trembling. The officer across from him narrowed his eyes. "What did you say?" Ethan shook his head quickly, swallowing the words. He looked down at his hands, twisting his wrists against the cuffs until they burned. The convoy rolled through the checkpoint without issue. The guards waved them through, oblivious to the boy inside, oblivious to the father trailing in the shadows. David let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He followed at a distance, his tires splashing through the waterlogged road. Every muscle in his body ached with tension. His mind replayed Ethan's broken voice. "Mom sold me. You're worthless. Please, Dad." The words stabbed deeper each time. He couldn't erase them, but he could still prove them wrong. The convoy turned off the highway onto a narrower road, the trees closing in on both sides. The rain hammered the windshield harder here, the storm almost swallowing the vehicles whole. David leaned forward, eyes narrowing. They were heading somewhere isolated, somewhere far from the eyes of the world. Inside the SUV, Ethan bit his lip until it bled. His thoughts spiraled in circles. His mother's betrayal, the chain on his ankle, the hopeless look on his father's face when the officers dragged him back. His chest tightened, suffocating. He wanted to believe his father was out there, that he hadn't been abandoned again. But hope felt dangerous. Hope hurt too much when it broke. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The rain blurred everything outside into streaks of light and shadow. In his mind, he whispered one last prayer. "Please, Dad, don't give up on me." On the road behind, David whispered the same words under his breath, gripping the wheel so hard his hands ached. "Hold on, Ethan. I'm right here. I'm not letting you go." The storm swallowed both of them, father and son separated by steel, glass, and betrayal, but bound by the fragile thread of a promise neither of them could afford to break. The road narrowed into a twisting ribbon of asphalt swallowed by towering trees. Rain hammered the windshield in sheets, the wipers barely keeping up. David's truck crawled 100 yards behind the convoy, his headlights dimmed, his hands gripping the steering wheel as though letting go would cost him his son forever. Every flash of red taillights ahead kept him alive. Every curve of the road made his chest tighten. Don't lose them. Don't lose him. After nearly an hour, the convoy slowed. David leaned forward, eyes narrowing through the storm. Up ahead, floodlights pierced the darkness. A tall chain-link fence emerged from the trees, topped with coils of barbed wire glistening in the rain. Behind it, a squat warehouse squatted like a shadow, ugly, windowless, and menacing. At the entrance stood a guardhouse. Two men stepped out, their raincoats shining under the lamps. One raised a flashlight, the beam sweeping across the approaching SUVs. David killed his headlights instantly, pulling off the road into a ditch. Branches scraped against the side of his truck as he crouched low over the wheel. His breath fogged the glass as he watched. The lead SUV rolled to a stop. The driver leaned out, handed over paperwork. The guard checked it, nodded, and pressed a button. The gate buzzed, sliding open with a slow metallic groan. One by one, the vehicles slipped inside. The last SUV, Ethan's SUV vanished through the gate. The guardhouse light flickered, then steadied. The gate slammed shut. David's fist slammed against the steering wheel. He was too far to follow inside, too close to walk away. He could feel Ethan's presence, trapped, terrified, just beyond that fence. Inside the SUV, Ethan's heart thudded against his ribs. His wrists ached from the cuffs, his ankle rubbed raw by the chain. The SUV jolted to a stop in front of the warehouse. The doors opened, and cold rain lashed his face as hands yanked him out. "Move!" He stumbled forward, nearly falling in the mud. The floodlights blinded him, shadows of men with rifles stretching across the lot. He blinked rapidly, searching through the rain, desperate for one familiar shape. "Dad, please!" But all he saw was darkness. The officers dragged him toward the warehouse. Its doors creaked open, revealing a sterile white corridor inside. The place reeked of bleach and metal, not safety, not freedom, a cage with cleaner walls. Ethan tried to resist, his voice breaking. "I don't belong here. Please, I'm not." "Quiet," one officer snapped, shoving him forward. From the ditch, David's chest caved in as he watched his son disappear into the building. His nails dug into his palms, so hard he tasted blood in his mouth. Every instinct screamed at him to storm the gate, to rip the fence apart with his bare hands. But he forced himself still. Charging now would get him shot before he reached the door. He crouched lower, studying every detail. 2 guards at the gate. A rotating spotlight sweeping the yard every 20 seconds. Cameras mounted on poles, their red lights blinking like cold eyes. The warehouse had only one entrance visible. He filed everything away. If he couldn't get Ethan tonight, he'd get him soon. He would learn this place, break it apart piece by piece if he had to. Inside, Ethan was shoved into a room no bigger than a storage closet. A cot bolted to the floor, a thin blanket folded neatly. A camera stared down from the corner, its red light blinking. The officer unlocked his cuffs, but kept the ankle chain fastened to a bolt in the floor. "Get some rest," the man muttered. "You'll be here a while." The door slammed. Ethan collapsed onto the cot, curling into himself. The walls felt closer with every breath. His chest heaved as silent tears burned his cheeks. He whispered into the emptiness, "Dad, don't forget me." Outside the fence, hidden by rain and shadows, David whispered back, as though his son could hear him. "I'm right here, Ethan. I'll never forget. I'll never leave." His soaked clothes clung to his skin, but his resolve burned hotter than the storm. Tomorrow, he would find a way inside. Tomorrow, he would tear down every wall between them. Whatever it took. The storm had thinned into a steady drizzle by dawn, leaving the forest hushed, dripping, and gray. David crouched low behind a thicket of trees, his eyes fixed on the compound. He hadn't slept a second. He couldn't. Every flicker of a floodlight, every shuffle of a guard's boots, every creak of the gate was etched into his mind. His body was exhausted, but his resolve had never been sharper. Ethan was inside that warehouse, chained again, suffering again. And no wall of steel, no uniform, no badge would stop him from pulling his boy out. David adjusted the tire iron strapped across his back with duct tape. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. His eyes tracked the guards at the front gate. 2 men, trading shifts every half hour. A spotlight sweeping the yard. He had already mapped the blind spots, timed the rotations. If he moved fast, he could slip in before anyone noticed. Inside the warehouse, Ethan stirred on the cot. His body ached from the cold, his throat dry from crying. He pulled weakly against the chain bolted to the floor, but it clanged back without mercy. The camera in the corner blinked its red light, watching him without pause. The door opened suddenly. Ethan flinched as the older officer, the one from the gas station, stepped in. His raincoat was gone now, replaced by a black uniform, a badge gleaming under the harsh light. He carried a clipboard. "You did good last night," the man said flatly. "Kept the trafficker talking long enough for us to move in. That's the kind of cooperation we need." Ethan's eyes burned with tears. "I didn't cooperate. You chained me. You made me do it." The officer crouched, his face hardening. "Your mother gave consent. You belong to this operation until we say otherwise." Ethan's chest heaved, fury breaking through the fear. She sold me. You chained me. And you call this justice? The officer's jaw clenched. He leaned in close, his voice a whisper. You think your father can save you? He already failed once. He'll fail again. Ethan's lip quivered, but he refused to look away. His silence was his only act of defiance. Outside, David slipped through a gap in the fence where rain had rusted the links loose. He crouched low, every muscle taut, every breath measured. The yard was slick with mud, but he moved like a shadow, darting between stacks of crates and parked vehicles until he reached the side of the warehouse. His chest heaved as he pressed his ear to the wall. Voices carried faintly from inside, muffled but unmistakable. Ethan's voice, and that man's. David's blood ran hot. He worked his way to the back, where a smaller service door sat under a flickering lamp. A keypad glowed red beside it. Locked. He clenched his jaw, scanning the area. A delivery truck sat nearby, its driver's door open, keys dangling from the ignition. On the seat, an ID badge rested against a clipboard. David's eyes narrowed. He slipped forward, heart pounding, and snatched the badge. His hands trembled as he pressed it against the keypad. For a breathless second, nothing happened. Then, beep. The light turned green. The door clicked. Inside, Ethan sat with his fists clenched, trembling as the officer scribbled notes. Suddenly, a faint creak echoed from the hall. The officer turned, frowning, but before he could react, the door burst open. David stood there, soaked, wild-eyed, the tire iron in his hand. Get away from my son. Ethan's heart lurched, his breath catching. Dad! The officer rose slowly, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. You're making a mistake, Hale. David's grip tightened on the iron. His voice shook, but it was steady with conviction. The only mistake I made was trusting any of you. For a moment, the room pulsed with silence. Rain pattered on the roof. The camera's red light blinked. Ethan's chains rattled faintly as he shifted. Then the officer smirked, almost pitying. You really don't understand, do you? This isn't about your son. He's just leverage. We're not just after traffickers. We're after politicians, businessmen, people your ex-wife knew. She gave us him because he's the perfect tool. The truth crashed into David like thunder. Laura hadn't just sold Ethan for drugs. She had sold him into a machine bigger, darker than he had ever imagined. The officer's hand closed on his pistol. David stepped forward, raising the tire iron. His voice was low, raw, shaking with fury. He's not your tool. He's my son. Ethan's eyes flooded with tears, his body trembling. But for the first time in months, a spark of hope lit behind them. For a heartbeat, the warehouse room was frozen in time. The older officer's hand hovered near his pistol. David's tire iron gleamed under the buzzing fluorescent light. Ethan sat on the cot, his wrists trembling, his eyes darting between them in terror and desperate hope. Then everything exploded. The officer drew his weapon in one sharp motion. David lunged, swinging the tire iron with the weight of years of guilt and fury behind it. The metal cracked against the officer's forearm, sending the pistol clattering across the floor. Dad! Ethan cried, scrambling upright, the chain rattling at his ankle. The officer roared in pain, but he was quick, too quick. He slammed his shoulder into David, knocking him against the wall. The tire iron slipped from David's grasp, clanging against the concrete. David groaned, vision swimming, but he didn't fall. He launched himself forward again, tackling the officer. They grappled violently, boots scuffing the floor, fists landing hard. Every blow David took only fed the fire inside him. He wasn't just fighting a man. He was fighting years of betrayal, the system that had broken his son, the ex-wife who had sold him. The officer snarled, shoving David back. You'll ruin everything. Do you know who's behind this? Do you know how high this goes? David spat blood, his chest heaving. I don't care if it goes all the way to the White House. He's not yours to use. He slammed his fist into the officer's jaw. The man staggered. David dove for the pistol on the floor, his fingers closing around the grip. He raised it with shaking hands, pointing it directly at the officer's chest. The room went silent again. Only the buzzing light. Only the rattling of Ethan's chain. The officer's lips curled into a bitter smile. If you pull that trigger, you'll prove us right. You'll be the criminal, not the hero. And your son will pay the price for the rest of his life. David's finger tightened on the trigger. His heart thundered. He thought of Ethan's voice at the gas station. You're worthless. He thought of the night Laura promised she'd get clean. He thought of every mile he'd driven, every second he'd spent in the shadows, following the convoy, refusing to give up. His voice came low, steady. I don't need to be a hero. I just need to be his father. The officer lunged. David fired. The shot echoed like thunder. The officer crumpled, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. His pistol clattered uselessly away. He groaned, but he was finished. David dropped the gun instantly, chest heaving, his hands trembling. He rushed to Ethan, falling to his knees beside him. Ethan, it's over. I've got you. Ethan's breath hitched, tears streaking his face. His small hands clutched David's shirt, as though afraid he would vanish if he let go. You came back, he whispered. You really came back. David's throat closed. He pulled his son close, the boy's thin frame shaking in his arms. I'll never leave you again. Not ever. The chain at Ethan's ankle clanged harshly against the floor. David's eyes flared with anger. He grabbed the tire iron from the ground and brought it down with a furious strike. Sparks flew. Again. Until at last, the lock snapped, the chain falling free with a metallic crash. Ethan stared down at his bare ankle, disbelief flooding his face. Then he looked back at his father, a faint, fragile spark of hope flickering in his eyes. Alarms wailed suddenly, red lights flashing through the corridor outside. David knew they had only minutes before the compound swarmed. He lifted Ethan into his arms, the boy clinging tight, and sprinted through the service door he had forced open earlier. The rain poured down again, washing the blood and grime from their faces as they stumbled into the trees. Shouts echoed behind them, but the storm muffled everything. They didn't stop until the compound lights faded into the distance. Both of them collapsed beneath a tree, gasping for air, soaked to the bone. Ethan clung to his father, his voice trembling. What happens now? David cupped his son's face, meeting his broken eyes with unshakable resolve. Now we disappear. We don't need them. We don't need anyone. As long as we're together, that's all that matters. Ethan nodded weakly, his tears mixing with the rain. For the first time in months, he let himself believe it might be true. And as thunder rumbled over the forest, father and son sat huddled in the storm, free, but scarred, knowing the world had been forever changed by what happened at that gas station.